Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the San Jose Sharks 2024 trade deadline preview. The San Jose Sharks are not playing any actual games over these next couple of weeks, and so what better time than to take a look at who the Sharks will be looking to move at the deadline that is just a few weeks away. The Sharks find themselves as a seller at this deadline to the surprise of nobody, and so they'll be looking to create some sort of fire sale of players to acquire as many future assets as possible, whether that be in the form of draft picks, young roster players, or even just prospects who have yet to see the light of day in the NHL. The Sharks will be looking to acquire anything for these players who will not be with the San Jose Sharks almost certainly next season due to their expiring contracts. So let us start off immediately with the player who was expected coming into this deadline to have the most value from a Sharks perspective, and that is likely to maintain itself, but maybe not to the hype that was expected when he was acquired this past offseason from the Florida Panthers. That, of course, being Anthony Duclair. He was acquired from Florida for a salary cap dump, and so the Sharks only had to give up Steven Lorentz and a 5th-round pick. And as a former 30-goal, 50-point type of scorer, had he managed to maintain that type of performance, the Sharks would have been looking at trying to get a first-round pick for his services. And we can see that the market for that is very much alive, because just a few days ago, it was the Montreal Canadiens trading Sean Monahan to the Winnipeg Jets for a first-round pick. So this was a very, very viable trade for the San Jose Sharks back at the beginning of the season. But that is no longer the case, because his production has not held up at all. If we were to actually project his stats over a full 82-game season, instead of the previous 30-goal, 50-point score that the Sharks thought they were getting, they would have instead a 15-goal, 30-point score, which is the type of production that does not command a first-round pick in return. To really sort of emphasize that, Monahan, who was traded a couple days ago for that type of value, has more points already this season than Duclair would have over a full 82-game year. And so the first-round pick train, that has already left the station. That's not going to actually happen. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the Sharks won't be able to get some value back, and it's quite important that the Sharks do. While Duclair is still technically on the correct side of 30, it's not by all that much, and by the time the Sharks are looking to be competitive again, his window he's definitely going to be outside of that window, and he's not really the type of player that the Sharks are going to want to retain. And so they're going to look to move him, and especially when you consider the fact that in that deal that acquired him originally, the Sharks gave up a 5th-round pick, you do want to look to improve on that by at least a decent amount. And so what can the Sharks actually get back for Anthony Duclair? Well, that becomes a bit more complicated. Certainly his production this season hasn't been very good, and just from watching how he has played, it's also not been all that great. But two things do work somewhat in his favor. First of all, as I mentioned, he's still relatively young, which means you are expecting, or you could expect, some sort of bounce back performance. His recent seasons of 30 goals and 50 points were not all that far in the past, and so it is possible that he can bounce back from his relatively off year thus far this season. When you combine that with the fact that the Sharks are one of the lowest scoring teams in the league, and one of the lowest scoring teams that the league has seen in a while, that would sort of compound with the fact that Duclair, maybe he's just not having a good season because he's not on a very good team. The second reason there for Duclair is that he actually has a bit of playoff pedigree, as he was with the Florida Panthers last season for their pretty surprising Stanley Cup Finals run, where they ended up losing to the Vegas Golden Knights. He played 20 games with the Florida Panthers and put up a very respectable 11 points, which already in the playoffs, where scoring is lower, is actually quite good. But when you also consider the fact that Duclair is not the best player on Florida and was not getting the top minutes, that was clearly reserved for players like Tkachuk, Barkov, and Sam Reinhart, Duclair's 11 points in 20 games is really, really solid for a middle six type of guy. And so he is not only coming from a really bad team, which you could say is deflating his point totals, but you also know that he is quite good at performing when it matters, which is in the playoffs. And so that will drive his value up somewhat. Not enough to reach that first round threshold that the Sharks were really, really hoping for, but a 3rd round or potentially even a 2nd round pick, depending on how competitive the market is in terms of these types of rental forwards, forwards is definitely possible. The other question that we must ask ourselves has to do with the financials here, and not just for Duclair, but for every other player on this board, as a lot of the times teams will retain money on the contracts that they trade to make it work for these buying teams, because a lot of buying teams are right there at the top of the salary cap ceiling. Now, technically, it should be noted that when a team acquires a player at the deadline, they do not need to have the cap space for their entire cap hit. So in the case of Duclair, he's got a $3 million cap hit, but a team doesn't need to have $3 million of cap space to make it work, as there is a semi-complicated formula of how to prorate a player's deal over the remaining days in the NHL compared to how many days there are in the full NHL season. You do like the math, X carry the Y, whatever, to make these sort of financials actually work. Basically, the idea is you do not need the $3 million cap space, but you do still need some cap space to make it happen. And so a lot of teams do retain money, but the Sharks don't have that much of a luxury for that this season, because a team can only retain on 3 contracts at a time, and the Sharks already have Brent Burns and Erik Karlsson on the books. So there's only space for one more player, and if it is Anthony Duclair, suddenly the rest of the players on this draft board need to be traded for their full value. And considering Duclair has the most possible value out of all of these players, he would be one of the only ones you could probably get away with not retaining any deals or any money on. But at that point, that will likely drive his asset value slightly downwards if a team has to take on his entire deals. And so a 3rd round pick might be more viable if you're not retaining any money, but if a team is saying, yeah, you take 50% and we'll even give you a 2nd round pick, that does have to be the type of decision that Mike Grier makes in this type of situation. Is it worth sort of kind of sacrificing the potential moves later on to get the slightly better value here? I'm honestly not too sure about it. You really do have to feel out what other possible assets you can get back for the other players here to see if Duclair is worth being your one contract retained, because one thing is for sure that by the time the trade deadline passes, the Sharks will have their full 3 contract retention slots filled. Next, we come to Alexander Baranov. Now, he's in a much worse spot than Duclair. While coming into this season in the offseason, he was also expected to be a player who the Sharks could get some decent value for. Perhaps not a 1st-round pick, but maybe even a 2nd-round pick. He has not lived up to expectations at all. In fact, he makes Duclair's season look like a McDavid type of year, because Baranov has just been so bad this season. He's on pace for something over a full 82 games of like 25 points, and if you actually watch him play, he doesn't even feel like he deserves that. He is invisible for much of the games that he has played, and on top of that, he doesn't have that same type of value that Duclair has. Duclair had put up good performances on some pretty decent teams like the Florida Panthers, where he's not necessarily getting the top minutes, and he had those playoff performances last season. When it comes to Baranov, he has yet to make the playoffs in his pretty short NHL career, and while he has had some good seasons in the past, similar to Duclair, not only does he not have the goal scoring to go with it, he's not a former 30 goal scorer, instead he's just a former 15 goal scorer, but also he was playing top minutes for a pretty bad San Jose Sharks team. So if he's the only guy there, maybe you're thinking that those point totals come a bit easier. And so the value that he has as an asset at this trade deadline is pretty much significantly lower than what Duclair has, which does beg the question of whether or not Baranov can even be traded in the first place. While Duclair, I was saying, a 2nd to 3rd round pick, I'd be surprised if Baranov could get any more than a 4th round pick. Baranov does only make about $2.5 million, which is not the end of the world for a team to pick up in full, but I don't know if Baranov is the type of player that you want to waste your salary retention slot on, because I still can't really see him getting any more at best a 3rd round pick from a really desperate team who does think that he can rebound. But I can imagine that for any team who has had scouts in the arena watching Baranov play, there isn't really a lot of saving graces in his game. His power play performances have been pretty subpar this season. He doesn't play the penalty kill. His defensive game isn't all that great, and so you're really only picking him up for some point totals that just aren't there thus far this season. So Baranov may very well still be a San Jose Shark by the time the trade deadline passes. Next, we come to Kevin Leank. Now, he's a very interesting name on this list. He does carry the highest cap hit here, which means likely enough, if the Sharks are going to move on from Leank, he will have to be their salary retention slot for this season. Now, Leank is kind of similar to Anthony Duclair. Over the past few years, he has been with the San Jose Sharks, and he has been healthy scratched a good amount, but his point totals are still relatively solid. But when you go back to the 18-19 season is where things were very, very good for Leank. Not only did he put up a really hefty amount of points in the regular season, but he was also a very good playoff performer for the San Jose Sharks, kind of similar to Duclair. The issue here is that it's in the pretty distant past at this point. That's about 4 or 5 years ago right now. And so while Leank is still relatively young, you don't know if he can actually get back to that point. And considering he has been a healthy scratch for a decent chunk of this season, teams will see that and say, well, there's clearly something wrong perhaps behind the scenes for why he doesn't get as many games as he does. And so at this point, while there might be a team willing to take a flyer on a player who has had previous success in these types of situations, especially for a team perhaps looking to improve in the power play position, I don't know if the financials can work. I don't know if the Sharks are willing to sacrifice the retention slot for like the 4th round pick max that Leank would actually demand in return for his trade. So kind of like with Baranov, I would not be surprised if Kevin Leank is still a San Jose Shark, and it is likely that we're going to wait till the offseason where Leank will not return to San Jose, and a team at that point will be willing to take a chance on him for like a 1-year deal. Next, we move on to Mike Hoffman, another player on an expiring contract, but kind of like Kevin Leank, is pretty expensive, slightly less than Leank at $4.5 million, but his performance thus far this season also doesn't really match up with the value that he has on that deal, which means the Sharks would again have to use Hoffman as their one retention slot to actually move him at the deadline. Hoffman has definitely been better than Kevin Leank, while he has been a healthy scratch a couple of times this season. I would say if you are a scout watching him in the audience, you are relatively impressed with Hoffman, but I don't necessarily think that that would be enough to actually go out and really want to pick him up for your team. His power play performances have been decent enough, but not nearly as good as you might think. Obviously, he doesn't play the penalty kill. You're not really picking him up defensively, though he's been serviceable in that area thus far this season. So you're mostly looking for his even strength play, which I will say has been decent enough this season where I would maybe be willing to take a flyer on him. But again, I don't know if the financials actually work out. In terms of actual value perhaps coming back, I can't imagine it, kind of like with Kevin Leank, being any more than like a 4th round pick. Again, it depends on the desperation of the market, whether or not how many there are rental forwards available for these buying teams and how many of these rental forwards the buying teams actually want to look to acquire, where maybe Hoffman could stretch into a 3rd round pick, but even that is a massive pipe dream. I would say a 4th round pick at max, and maybe even like a 5th round pick would be more deserving for his type of player. Then we move on to Luke Kunin. Now, Kunin does have 1 year remaining on his contract, but unlike the other 4 players here are all unrestricted free agents, Kunin is actually a restricted free agent, though should be mentioned with arbitration rights. Kunin makes about $2.75 million, so his deal is a lot more favorable than the likes of Leank and Mike Hoffman, and Kunin also is the type of player, unlike Hoffman and Leank, who you would value from a playoff perspective because he is at the slightly more physical and maybe more defensively oriented. Now, from having watched this season, I don't think Kunin really has all that much value, but perhaps GMs will see things differently because, of course, a lot of them, especially for the playoffs, as mentioned, liked his type of player, especially since he also does play in that penalty killing role. So perhaps as a semi-cost controlled restricted free agent player, the Sharks could move him at the deadline this season. I don't know how likely that is to actually happen. Perhaps even the Sharks want to keep him. I know Mike Grier seems to have specifically targeted him originally from Nashville and gave him that 2-year deal, which I thought was a massive overpayment, and yet I still think that to this day, but maybe Mike Grier still wants to keep him on the team for whatever reason. But at the deadline, maybe he can get like a 4th or a 5th round pick in return. It's definitely possible, and it's also possible that the Sharks can pull that off without the salary retention, though that is even somewhat of a stretch. Then we get to the goaltenders for San Jose. Now, this is perhaps the most interesting spot. As you'll notice, moving in through these 5 forwards, besides Duclair, who I would say is pretty much a lock to be moved for at least some decent value, the other 4 players may very well still be with San Jose by the time the trade deadline passes. The goaltending position is one where, again, a trade could actually happen, kind of similar to Duclair, and the Sharks could actually get some decent value back here. The Sharks currently are working with 2 goaltenders who are playing at a pretty high level thus far this season, especially when you consider how these goaltenders look, or at least how these goaltenders looked last year. Blackwood was with the Devils and was playing terribly. Kakkonen was with the Sharks and he was one of the worst goaltenders in the league. But now both of these goalies are above average. Kakkonen, in fact, is actually in the top 20 goaltenders in the league, which is pretty much close to half at this point, especially when you consider a lot of backups play a good amount of games these days in the NHL, since teams do not want to overplay their starter during the regular season. And there are definitely teams looking to get some goaltending help, not even just from a backup perspective, but perhaps even from a starting perspective as well. Taking a look at a team like the Los Angeles Kings, they're kind of floundering at this point as a semi-borderline playoff team at this point because they don't really have a set starting goaltender. The same would have to do with a team like the Carolina Hurricanes, who are dealing with injuries and goalies maybe not looking up to their actual top level, so maybe they would be looking to pick up another type of player. And both Kakkonen and Blackwood are available from a San Jose Sharks perspective. Now, Blackwood is the only player on this board who is not on an expiring contract. That is important to remember. He does have 1 more year after this, which could somewhat throw a wrench in the plan. But if the Sharks are willing to part with the goalie, there is likely a market for it. Now, could the Sharks get a first-round pick? Perhaps from a really desperate team, it could work, but I'd say highly doubtful still. However, a second-round pick in return for a player like Kaapo Kakkonen might not actually be completely out of the question. Now, one thing that does need to be brought up is whether or not the Sharks actually want to trade one of these goalies. Eventually, if the Sharks are going to look to compete within the next couple of years, it is possible that one of Kakkonen or Blackwood could be the starter, at least for the first couple of years of that, considering they've been solid enough thus far this year on a pretty bad San Jose Sharks team. And so Mike Grier, again, like with Duclair, has to make a decision of is it better off keeping both of these goalies to see what works out, especially if you think you can re-sign Kakkonen in the offseason, or should one of them be traded, bring up a random goalie from the AHL to be the backup for the other, and ride them for the rest of the season? We shall see what Grier decides to do, but the value is certainly there to trade. And then finally, we have the others group here. It turns out the Sharks actually have a lot of players on expiring contracts, but I don't want to discuss here like 13, 14 different players where this video would end up taking like over half an hour. And so a lot of these guys, while they definitely could be moved, I honestly wouldn't be surprised to see like 1, maybe even 2 of them get moved at this trade deadline. They're not really going to command a lot of value in return. This has to do with players like Justin Bailey, Ryan Carpenter, Kalen Addison, these guys on 1-year deals who aren't necessarily that much of an interesting pickup for any team. For instance, Justin Bailey, if a team is looking to get some size and some speed, they might look to target him, but would he get anything more than like a 5th round pick or like a 6th round pick? Probably not. Still decent value that the Sharks should probably go for just to get as many future assets as possible, but not super interesting either. But that will do it for this trade deadline preview. Honestly, coming into this deadline, it was expected that the Sharks could end up being a massive seller. You know, in the offseason, you're looking at Duclair and Baranov as 2 really big pieces. You're looking at Mike Hoffman could bounce back. Leank could be playing in a decent role, things of these natures. At this point, I'd be surprised if the Sharks got a first-round pick at all from any of these players. And while you're still going to get some decent value, probably a lot less than what people were hoping for. So going into this one, it's going to be okay, but not great. Class dismissed.